He wanted to know who saw him as a man instead of a mansion. So he gave 3 women his wealth and watched what they did with it, and what his black maid chose changed not only his understanding of love, but rewrote his entire definition of what it means to truly be rich. Jonathan Sterling had everything the world said mattered: billions in the bank, properties across continents, power that opened every door, yet he sat alone at the top, wondering if anyone would stay, if the money disappeared. So he devised an experiment born from loneliness and curiosity, giving unlimited credit cards to 3 women who orbited different parts of his life. Angela, his beautiful girlfriend who lived for luxury; Gabriella, his ambitious assistant who lived for advancement; and Margaret John, his humble black maid who lived for something he couldn't quite name yet. 3 cards, 3 days, 3 women, and one question that haunted him late at night. Would any of them choose compassion over convenience, substance over shine, him over his fortune? Hello, family, and welcome. Before we dive into this incredible journey, if you think money shouldn't define love, hit subscribe, because it truly means the world to our community. Share this video with your friends and loved ones who need to hear this story, and don't forget to turn on post notifications so you never miss our future videos. Thank you so much for your support. And now sit back, relax, and let's step into Jonathan Sterling's world. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, painting everything in shades of gold and silver, as if the sun itself was trying to justify the price tag of the view. 45 stories below, the city moved with its usual chaos: taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, dreams colliding with reality on every corner. But up here in this glass tower, everything felt suspended in a strange, sterile silence. Jonathan Sterling stood before those massive windows, holding a cup of black coffee in one hand, while his other rested in the pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, jacket unbuttoned, no tie, the uniform of a man who'd earned the right to be casually powerful. He looked like success personified, like every Forbes cover and business school case study wrapped into one commanding presence. But if you looked closely at his eyes, those tired, searching eyes, you'd see something else entirely, something that no amount of money had managed to fix. The world knew Jonathan Sterling as the genius behind Sterling Tech Solutions, the man who'd revolutionized cloud security infrastructure and made artificial intelligence accessible to Fortune 500 companies. His name appeared in TED Talks and boardroom discussions from Silicon Valley to Singapore, whispered with equal parts admiration and envy by people who measured success in zeros behind numbers. At 45, he'd built a $3.2 billion empire from nothing but code, caffeine, and an obsessive drive that burned through his 20s and 30s like fuel. And now he stood at the peak with everything he'd ever worked for spread out before him like a kingdom. Yet somehow, standing in the middle of all this achievement, Jonathan felt like he was suffocating in a glass cage of his own making, surrounded by luxury but starving for something real, something that didn't come with a price tag or hidden agenda. "Mr. Sterling, your morning briefing is ready whenever you are," came a soft voice from behind him, so quiet it almost seemed apologetic for existing. Jonathan turned slightly to see Margaret John standing near the doorway of the study, keeping a respectful distance as she always did, as if there were invisible lines drawn throughout the penthouse that she'd trained herself never to cross. She wore her usual uniform, a simple navy dress with white collar, practical flats, her dark hair pulled back in a neat, no-nonsense bun that framed her face without calling attention to itself. At 25, Margaret had worked for him for almost 2 years, moving through his home with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible to most visitors, and yet Jonathan had noticed lately that she carried herself with a dignity that had nothing to do with status or salary. Her eyes, when they occasionally met his, held a warmth and intelligence that seemed at odds with how carefully she'd learned to disappear. "Thank you, Margaret," Jonathan said with a small nod, and she slipped back out of the room as soundlessly as she'd entered, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his coffee. He sighed deeply and turned back to the windows, but his mind wasn't on the view anymore. It was on the life he'd constructed and the people who inhabited it. His phone buzzed on the marble counter behind him, Probably Angela sending another message from whatever exclusive resort she was currently enjoying. Probably another perfectly filtered selfie with a caption full of heart emojis and designer shopping bags. Yesterday it was, "Missing you, babe. Can't wait to show you what I found at the boutique. You're going to love it. And the price tag, LOL." He hadn't responded because he couldn't figure out what to say to someone who only seemed to remember he existed when there was something new to buy, and that realization sat in his stomach like a stone he couldn't digest. The sharp click of heels on marble announced another presence before Gabriella appeared in his peripheral vision, tablet in hand, perfectly pressed blazer, every strand of her hair strategically placed to project competence and ambition. "Jonathan, good morning," she said with professional warmth that never quite reached the calculation behind her eyes. "I've compiled the quarterly reports you requested, and I've also taken the liberty of scheduling your appearances for the tech summit in Dubai next month. Thought you'd want to get ahead of it." "Gabriella, clear my schedule for the next week," Jonathan said without turning around, his voice flat and final. There was a pause, a beat of confusion that broke through her polished exterior. "I'm sorry, the entire week? But you have the investor meeting on Wednesday, and Angela mentioned something about dinner plans, and there's the—" "Cancel it all," he interrupted, finally turning to face her, and something in his expression made her take a half step back. "Reschedule what you can, cancel what you can't, and don't ask me why." Gabriella's professional mask flickered for just a second. Surprise, maybe frustration, definitely curiosity. But she recovered quickly, nodding with practiced grace. "Of course, consider it done," she said, and she left with the same efficiency she brought to everything, though Jonathan could feel the questions she was storing up for later. Jonathan walked away from the windows and into his private study, the one room in this architectural showcase that actually felt like it belonged to a human being rather than an interior design magazine. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that felt like sealing himself away from a world that demanded too much performance and not enough truth. The study was lined with shelves holding books he'd actually read: philosophy, psychology, worn paperback novels from his childhood that he couldn't bring himself to throw away, even though they didn't match the aesthetic of everything else. On his desk sat a silver-framed photograph of his parents, both gone now for over a decade, frozen in time at some family gathering when life was simpler and love didn't come with contracts. Jonathan picked up the photograph and stared at his father's face, remembering the conversation they'd had during his father's final hospital stay, when morphine had loosened his tongue but sharpened his wisdom. "Son, when you're this rich, you'll never know if they love you or your portfolio," his father had whispered, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "And that uncertainty will eat you alive if you let it. So don't build your life around people who only show up when the market's good." Those words echoed through Jonathan's mind now, as he sat heavily in the leather chair behind his desk, feeling the weight of his own loneliness pressing down on his shoulders like gravity had suddenly doubled. What was the point of building an empire if he couldn't trust anyone standing inside its walls? Angela was beautiful, impossibly, distractingly beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads in every room she entered and made other men look at him with barely concealed envy. But her affection seemed tied directly to his credit limit. He'd noticed how her warmth increased in direct proportion to the price of gifts, how her texts went cold whenever he was too busy to plan expensive weekends, how she'd never once asked him about his day unless it involved somewhere she wanted to go. And Gabriella, brilliant, ambitious, indispensable Gabriella, who ran his professional life with the precision of a Swiss watch, but who he'd once overheard at a company gala telling a colleague, "If I position myself right, I could go from executive assistant to Mrs. Sterling within 2 years. It's all about strategic proximity." That sentence had lodged itself in his brain like a splinter, poisoning every interaction since with the question, was she serving his interests or serving her own plan? Then there was Margaret, quiet and unassuming Margaret, who never asked for anything beyond her modest salary, who had actually refused when he'd offered to cover her mother's surgery after overhearing her worried phone conversation in the kitchen. "It's not your burden to carry, Mr. Sterling," she'd said with such gentle firmness. "I'll find a way. We always do. Who does that? Who turns down help when they desperately need it? The question had haunted him for months because it didn't fit any pattern he understood about how people operated in his world. Jonathan pulled out a leather notebook from his desk drawer and wrote 3 names in black ink: Angela, Gabriella, Margaret. 3 women, 3 completely different roles in his life, 3 possible answers to the question that kept him awake at night. Was there anyone in his orbit who saw Jonathan the man instead of Sterling the billionaire? He stared at those names until they started to blur, and then an idea crystallized in his mind with such clarity it felt almost dangerous, the kind of idea that you know will change everything once you act on it. He picked up his phone and dialed Marcus Chen, the head of his private security team, a man whose discretion was worth more than his substantial salary. Marcus, I need you to set something up for me, and it needs to be completely confidential. No paper trail, no digital footprint, just between us, Jonathan said when Marcus answered on the first ring. I'm listening, sir, Marcus replied with the professional calm of someone who'd handled sensitive situations before. I'm going to give 3 people access to an unlimited credit card for 72 hours, Jonathan explained, his voice steady even though his heart was starting to race with the implications of what he was about to do. I want full tracking on every transaction, amounts, locations, vendors, everything, but no physical surveillance in private spaces, no invasive monitoring, just financial behavior analysis. Can you coordinate that with the bank and set up a secure reporting system that sends updates directly to my private server? There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for Jonathan to imagine Marcus processing this unusual request and deciding whether to ask questions. Understood, sir. I'll have everything configured within the hour, Marcus finally said, choosing professionalism over curiosity. Is there anything else you need? No, that's all. And Marcus, thank you for not asking why, Jonathan said, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. Everyone's entitled to their reasons, sir, Marcus replied simply, and the line went dead. Jonathan ended the call and set the phone down, then stood up and walked to the full-length mirror mounted on the study wall, a mirror he usually avoided because he didn't particularly enjoy looking at himself anymore. He studied his reflection. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive haircut, all the markers of a man who'd won the game called success. But the eyes looking back at him belonged to someone who felt like he'd lost something more important along the way. Wealthy, powerful, respected, feared, envied, and completely, utterly alone. Not for much longer, he told his reflection, making it a promise he intended to keep. One way or another, I'm going to find out who's real. Friday morning arrived with that peculiar clarity that comes after a sleepless night, and Jonathan was already at his desk by 6 a.m., making calls that would set everything in motion. His first conversation was with his private banker at Chase, a man named Vincent who handled accounts for people who required discretion more than they required attention, and Jonathan explained what he needed in terms that were vague enough to avoid questions but specific enough to get results. 3 separate platinum cards, each linked to a tracking system that would monitor every transaction in real time, all feeding data to a secure server that only Jonathan could access. Vincent asked no questions, simply confirmed that everything would be ready within 2 hours, and Jonathan appreciated that about people who understood that curiosity was expensive in his world. His second call went to Marcus Chen, a private investigator who specialized in what he called behavioral intelligence, which was a polite way of saying he watched people and figured out what they really wanted versus what they claimed to want. Jonathan had used Marcus before: background checks on potential business partners, verification of credentials that seemed too perfect to be true, and he trusted the man's discretion as much as he trusted his skill. I need financial behavior analysis on 3 individuals over a 72-hour period, Jonathan explained, and Marcus listened without interrupting as Jonathan laid out the parameters, the ethical boundaries, the information he wanted without crossing into actual surveillance. No physical following, no invasive monitoring, just transaction patterns and anything publicly observable, Jonathan emphasized, because even in his cynicism he had limits he wouldn't cross. Marcus agreed to have preliminary reports ready within 24 hours of the cards being activated, And that was that. Simple, professional, no judgment. By the time the sun fully rose over Manhattan, Jonathan had everything in place, and all that remained was the performance, the careful presentation of spontaneous generosity that would make the experiment work. He practiced his lines in his head while shaving, while choosing his navy suit, while drinking coffee that tasted like ash because his stomach was twisted with something that might have been anticipation or might have been guilt. The lunch with Angela was exactly what he expected it would be. Elaborate, performative, and strangely hollow, despite her genuine beauty and carefully practiced enthusiasm. He'd chosen Le Bernardin because Angela had mentioned it 3 times in the past month, each mention accompanied by a subtle hint that she'd love to go if he ever had time. And when they were seated at the best table with champagne already being poured, her face lit up with the kind of joy that seemed just slightly rehearsed. She looked stunning in a cream dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, and Jonathan told her so, watching as she beamed and launched into a story about where she'd found it, and who had helped her choose it, and how she'd been saving it for a special occasion. He waited until after the entrees arrived, until she was relaxed and happy, and already planning her Instagram posts about this meal, and then he slid the black envelope across the white tablecloth like it was nothing, like it wasn't a test disguised as a gift. "I have something for you," he said simply, and Angela's eyes went straight to the envelope with the kind of laser focus that confirmed every suspicion he'd been trying to ignore. When she opened it and saw the platinum card, her reaction was immediate and unfiltered, pure excitement that made her gasp audibly, made her reach across the table to grab his hand, made her ask 3 times if this was real and if there was really no limit. "Use it however you want for the next 3 days, Jonathan told her, watching her face carefully, noting how quickly gratitude transformed into calculation, how her eyes went distant as she mentally cataloged everything she could buy. She kissed him enthusiastically, told him he was incredible, told him she didn't know what she'd done to deserve this. But even as she said the words, Jonathan noticed she was already pulling out her phone, already opening shopping apps, already moving past gratitude into acquisition mode. Gabriella's reaction was more controlled but no less revealing. Back at his home office, he called her in with the excuse of discussing scheduling, and when he presented her card, she handled it with the same careful professionalism she brought to everything, asking smart questions about appropriate use and expressing measured gratitude that sounded rehearsed even when it was probably genuine. "Is this appropriate given our working relationship?" she asked, and Jonathan appreciated the question, even as he recognized it as strategic positioning, a way to establish boundaries while accepting the gift. "Consider it a performance bonus," he told her, giving her the framework she needed to feel comfortable, and he watched as she relaxed, thanked him sincerely, and mentioned several professional investments she'd been considering. But it was Margaret's reaction that stayed with him long after the day ended. He found her in his study around 6 p.m., dusting bookshelves with that quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and when he asked her to sit down, the fear that flashed across her face made his chest tighten with shame he hadn't expected to feel. She perched on the edge of the chair like she was ready to run, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide and worried, and when he handed her the envelope, she didn't open it immediately. "What is this, Mr. Sterling?" she asked so quietly he almost didn't hear her, and when he explained it was for her personally, she tried to give it back, her hands trembling, tears filling her eyes as she insisted she didn't need anything, that her salary was enough, that this was too much. Jonathan had to practically beg her to accept it, had to watch her clutch the card to her chest like it was both precious and terrifying, had to see the genuine shock and confusion on her face that stood in such stark contrast to Angela's eager excitement and Gabriella's calculated gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite hide, and then she fled back to the kitchen, leaving Jonathan sitting alone in his study wondering what exactly he'd just set in motion. That evening, after all 3 women had left with their cards, Jonathan sat in his penthouse with a glass of scotch he didn't really want and watched the sun set over the city. The tracking system was active, the 72-hour clock was ticking, and somewhere out there, 3 women were making choices that would tell him everything he needed to know about who they really were. He took a sip of his drink and wondered what the next 3 days would reveal. Wondered if he was ready for whatever truth was coming. Wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake or finally asked the right question. Only time would tell. Saturday morning broke over Manhattan with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything look sharper, more defined, and Jonathan was already at his desk when the first notification pinged on his phone at 8:47 a.m., signaling that the experiment had truly begun. He'd barely slept, dozing fitfully in his study chair while his laptop hummed beside him, and now his eyes felt gritty and his coffee tasted bitter. But the exhaustion didn't matter because the data was starting to flow in, and with it came answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The tracking system Marcus had set up was elegant in its simplicity, a secure dashboard that updated in real time with every transaction, complete with merchant information, purchase amounts, timestamps, and GPS coordinates that painted a geographic story of where each woman chose to go when given unlimited freedom. Jonathan pulled up the interface and felt his stomach clench as he saw how quickly the numbers were climbing, how rapidly the weekend was revealing patterns that confirmed his worst suspicions and challenged assumptions he hadn't known he was making. Angela's spending looked like a wildfire tearing through his accounts with gleeful abandon. The first transaction had come through at 10:23 p.m., Friday night, 4,127 at a boutique in Soho that specialized in designer handbags, and from there it was like watching someone make up for every moment of restraint they'd ever shown. By Saturday morning, she'd already burned through $37,000, and the day was just getting started. Jonathan scrolled through the list with a growing sense of detachment. $8,900 for a Chanel bag, $6,200 for Hermes scarves, $2,400 for what was listed as luxury accessories at a boutique he didn't recognize, and then the really big purchases started rolling in. At 11:15 a.m., Angela dropped $35,000 on a weekend yacht rental, and Marcus's accompanying report noted that she'd been overheard telling the rental agent she was celebrating her boyfriend's success, even though Jonathan's name never came up in the conversation. By early afternoon, she'd spent another $23,000 on VIP club reservations and bottle service for a party she was apparently throwing that evening, and Marcus had flagged social media posts where Angela was posing with shopping bags, champagne glasses, and designer sunglasses, with captions that made Jonathan's jaw tighten. Self-made woman energy, read one post showing her wearing a custom jewelry piece that had cost $32,000, and nowhere in any of her carefully curated photos or clever captions was there a single mention of where the money came from or who had trusted her with it. Marcus's field notes were even more damning. He'd positioned an associate near enough to observe without intruding, and the report described Angela laughing with her friends about how easy it was to get the card, joking that she just had to look pretty and be patient, treating Jonathan's generosity like a game she'd won rather than a gift she'd been given. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, Angela had spent $127,000, and every dollar told the same story about who she was and what she valued. Comment, people over profit, if you're not siding with performative luxury. Gabriella's spending pattern was different but no less revealing. Where Angela's purchases screamed luxury and status, Gabriella's whispered strategy and ambition. Each transaction carefully calculated to advance some larger plan Jonathan was only beginning to understand. Her first major purchase was a $28,000 luxury car lease for a Mercedes she'd apparently been eyeing for months, and the salesman's notes indicated she'd specifically requested a model that projected executive presence. Next came $15,000 for an executive coaching program that promised to help participants position themselves for C-suite advancement, followed by $8,900 on what was described as professional wardrobe consulting at a boutique that catered to women climbing corporate ladders. But it was the $18,900 dinner reservation that really showed Jonathan what Gabriella was doing. Marcus's report indicated she'd booked a private dining room at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants and invited 7 carefully selected guests: tech executives, venture capitalists, industry journalists, all people who could help her build something separate from Jonathan, something that used his resources as a launching pad for her own ambitions. She'd positioned herself at the head of the table, Marcus noted, dressed in her new designer wardrobe, and spent the evening networking like someone who was already independent, already powerful, already beyond the need for the man who currently signed her paychecks. When Jonathan's name came up, she'd described him as a mentor who's been supportive of my development, which was technically true, but felt hollow in a way that made Jonathan's chest ache. By Sunday morning, Gabriella had spent $94,000, and every dollar was an investment in her exit strategy. And then there was Margaret. Jonathan stared at her transaction history for a long time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, trying to understand why someone given unlimited wealth would choose to spend so little on themselves. Her personal purchases totaled $340, $87 at a grocery store in Queens at 1:47 a.m. Friday night, $125 at a discount department store Saturday morning for clothing and household items, and $128 for a monthly bus pass and some basic necessities. That was it. That was all she'd spent on herself in 2 days of unlimited access to wealth that could have bought her anything she wanted. But the other transactions told a different story entirely. At 2:14 p.m. Saturday, Margaret's card showed an $18,000 payment to New York Presbyterian Hospital, and Jonathan immediately called Marcus to find out what that was about. The report came back within an hour. Mrs. Elizabeth Chen, age 73, Margaret's neighbor, dying of cancer with medical bills she couldn't pay, and Margaret had quietly, anonymously settled the entire debt. Then came a $25,000 donation to Hope House, a youth shelter in the Bronx, where Margaret apparently volunteered every Saturday, mentoring teenagers who'd aged out of foster care. After that were rent payments, $7,200 total, split between 3 different families in Margaret's building who were facing eviction, all of them receiving anonymous notices that their accounts were suddenly current. And finally, bulk food purchases totaling $8,140, all delivered to community organizations that fed homeless populations throughout Queens. Jonathan sat in his study late Saturday night with Marcus's detailed report spread across his desk, and something fundamental shifted in his chest as he read about Mrs. Chen's tearful gratitude, about the youth shelter director who'd called it a miracle, about the families who'd cried when they got notices saying they wouldn't lose their homes. Margaret had been given the same gift as Angela and Gabriella, the same freedom, the same power, and she'd used it to heal wounds in her community that Jonathan hadn't even known existed. She'd seen wealth not as something to display or leverage, but as a tool for lifting up everyone around her, and that choice told Jonathan more about her character than any interview or background check ever could. Sunday morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through his windows, and Jonathan made his decision. He picked up his phone and composed a message to all 3 women. "Dinner at my place this evening, 7 p.m., something important to discuss." The responses came quickly. Angela's full of emojis and enthusiasm, Gabriella's professionally confirmatory, Margaret's simple and respectful, and Jonathan set his phone down knowing that tonight everything would change. The experiment was over, the data was collected, and now came the hard part. Facing what he'd learned and accepting the consequences of choices he'd made out of loneliness and suspicion and a desperate need to know the truth. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of heavy silence that comes before storms, and Jonathan spent the afternoon preparing his penthouse for a dinner that would either destroy relationships or reveal truths that needed to be spoken. And either way, there was no going back from what he was about to do. He'd arranged for a catering service to prepare an elegant meal. Roasted duck, winter vegetables, wine pairings that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. And the dining table was set with crystal and silver that caught the light from the chandelier overhead, making everything look beautiful and formal and slightly intimidating. Jonathan stood in his study with 3 manila folders spread across his desk, each one labeled with a name and filled with transaction reports, investigator notes, and photographic evidence of choices that couldn't be explained away. And he felt his stomach twist with something that might have been dread or might have been resolve. Angela arrived first at exactly 7 p.m., punctual for once because she clearly sensed something important was happening. and she swept through the door in a stunning emerald dress that Jonathan immediately recognized from the transaction report. $8,400 from a boutique in Midtown, purchased Saturday afternoon while he was reading about her yacht party and her Instagram captions. She looked radiant, confident, completely unaware that she was walking into a reckoning, and she kissed his cheek with practiced warmth while asking in that bright, curious tone whether this was a celebration of some kind. "Something like that," Jonathan said vaguely, and he directed her to the dining room where she settled into a chair with easy grace, already scanning the table setting and clearly approving of the expensive presentation. Gabriella arrived 10 minutes later, apologizing for the delay with professional courtesy, and she was dressed in a sharp black power suit that Jonathan recognized from her executive wardrobe consulting purchase, the kind of outfit that announced competence and ambition before she even spoke. She greeted Angela with polite coolness, the two women clearly existing in different social circles despite orbiting the same man, and then she turned to Jonathan with that measured curiosity he'd come to recognize as her trademark approach to uncertainty. "Thank you for the invitation," Gabriella said, taking her seat across from Angela, "though I admit I'm intrigued about the occasion." Margaret was the last to arrive, and Jonathan heard the tentative knock on his door at 7:23 p.m., so different from Angela's confident entrance or Gabriella's professional arrival, and when he opened the door, he found her standing in the hallway looking absolutely terrified. She wore a simple navy dress that he recognized as the one she wore to church. He'd seen her leaving in it several Sunday mornings, and her hair was pulled back in that same practical bun, and everything about her posture screamed discomfort at being included in what clearly felt like a gathering where she didn't belong. "Mr. Sterling, I can come back if this is a bad time," Margaret said quietly, already half turning to leave, and Jonathan had to gently insist she come in, had to practically guide her to the dining room where Angela and Gabriella were already seated and looking at her with varying degrees of surprise and confusion. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on as all three women sat around Jonathan's elegant table, each occupying such clearly different positions in his life that their presence together felt jarring, wrong somehow, like he'd forced incompatible elements into the same space. Angela was lounging in her chair with wine already poured. Gabriella sat with perfect posture and professional composure, and Margaret perched on the very edge of her seat, looking like she might bolt at any moment, and Jonathan stood at the head of the table with 3 folders in his hands and felt the weight of what he was about to do settle over him like a sentence he'd passed on himself. "Thank you all for coming," Jonathan began, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart, and he placed the 3 folders on the table in front of him where everyone could see them. "I asked you here tonight because I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear what your choices revealed over the past 3 days." Angela's smile faltered slightly, and Gabriella's eyes narrowed with sharp intelligence, while Margaret just looked more confused and frightened than before. "Those credit cards I gave you," Jonathan continued, watching each face carefully, "they weren't just gifts. They were a test. I gave you freedom to show me who you really are when nobody's watching, when there are no limits and no consequences, and you all showed me exactly that." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with shock and realization, and the beginning of understanding that something fundamental had just shifted. Jonathan picked up the first folder with Angela's name written across the tab, and he opened it slowly, deliberately, giving her time to understand what was coming. "Angela, you spent $127,483 over 3 days, he said quietly, reading from the summary page. "And I want to walk through some of these purchases with you." Her face went from confusion to pale understanding, and her hand moved to her wine glass like she needed something to hold on to. $35,000 for a yacht rental where you told the agent you were celebrating your boyfriend's success but never actually mentioned my name. Jonathan continued, his voice calm but firm. $32,000 for custom jewelry that you posted on Instagram with the caption "Self-Made Woman Energy." $23,000 for VIP club reservations, where my investigator overheard you laughing with friends about how easy it was to get the card, about how you just had to look pretty and be patient. Angela's face flushed dark red, and her mouth opened and closed several times before words finally came out. sharp and defensive. You had me followed? You spied on me? Jonathan, this is entrapment. This is manipulation. You can't just... She was sputtering now, anger and embarrassment warring on her face, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I can't believe you did this, Angela spat, grabbing her designer handbag, the new one purchased with his money, and then apparently thinking better of it because she dropped it on the table like it had burned her. You're sick. You know that? You're a paranoid, controlling... But she didn't finish the sentence, just turned and stormed toward the door, her expensive heels clicking sharply against his marble floors, and then she was gone, leaving perfume and fury in her wake. Jonathan took a breath and turned to Gabriella, who had gone very still, her professional mask firmly in place, but her eyes showing the rapid calculations happening behind them. Gabriella, he said gently, opening her folder. 94,917 spent on very strategic purchases, a luxury car lease, executive coaching, professional wardrobe, a networking dinner where you positioned yourself as an independent power player. Jonathan, I can explain, Gabriella started, but he held up a hand. You described me as a mentor who's been supportive to potential investors, and my investigator heard you tell someone on the phone that you were planning to launch your own venture within 6 months, that you'd been careful to maintain good relations with your current employer, because I'd make a valuable reference, Jonathan said. And he wasn't angry, just tired, just sad that his suspicions had been so thoroughly confirmed. Gabriella's composure cracked just slightly, and she stood with careful dignity, smoothing down her new power suit. Everything I purchased was professional development, Jonathan. And yes, I have ambitions beyond being someone's assistant forever, she said, her voice controlled but her eyes flashing. I'm sorry if that offends you, but I won't apologize for planning my future. I'm not asking you to apologize for your ambition, Jonathan replied quietly. I'm asking you to acknowledge that you used my resources to build an exit strategy without ever once being honest about what you were doing. Gabriella's jaw tightened, and she nodded once, sharp and final. I'll have my resignation on your desk tomorrow morning, she said, and then she left too, with more grace than Angela, but the same fundamental understanding that she'd been found out. And then there was only Margaret, still sitting in her chair with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling in her lap, and Jonathan felt his heart break just a little as he looked at her genuine distress. Jonathan's voice softened as he picked up the third folder, the one with Margaret's name written across the tab in his own handwriting, and the entire atmosphere in the room shifted from confrontation to something gentler, something that felt almost sacred in its quiet intensity. Margaret was still crying silently, her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying desperately to suppress, and Jonathan moved closer to her, setting the folder on the table between them so they could both see what was inside. Margaret, Jonathan said gently, his own voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. You spent $43,465 over 3 days, but not on yourself. You spent $340 on yourself. The rest went to other people. He opened the folder and began reading the transactions aloud, his voice steady even as his hands trembled slightly. $18,000 to New York Presbyterian Hospital to pay off Mrs. Chen's cancer treatment bills, $25,000 to Hope House Youth Shelter, $7,200 in rent payments for 3 families in your building who were facing eviction, $5,000 to a community kitchen that feeds homeless populations, and $8,140 in bulk food purchases delivered to families in need throughout Queens. Margaret's tears fell faster now, and she covered her face with her hands, and Jonathan waited, giving her space to compose herself or fall apart, whichever she needed. Jonathan asked simply, the question carrying more weight than those 3 letters should have been able to hold. Margaret, why didn't you spend it on yourself? You could have bought anything, gone anywhere, done anything, but you gave it all away. Why? Margaret looked up at him with eyes that were red and swollen and completely devastatingly honest. Because I know what it's like to have nothing, she whispered, her voice breaking on every word. And when someone gives you something, you don't waste it on yourself, you pass it forward to people who have even less. She took a shuddering breath and continued, the words pouring out like she'd been holding them back for years. I grew up in poverty, Mr. Sterling. Real poverty, where my mama worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. Where we watched our neighbors lose everything because one medical bill or one missed rent payment meant the difference between having a home and sleeping in shelters. I learned early that survival wasn't individual. It was communal. It meant lifting each other up because if we didn't, nobody else was going to do it for us. Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest as he listened to her speak. As he understood for the first time the depth of character that had been moving through his home for 2 years, while he'd barely noticed her existence. The experiment had revealed more than just who these 3 women were. It had exposed his own blindness, his own privilege, his own failure to see the treasure that had been right in front of him all along. While he'd been looking for someone who could appreciate his wealth, Margaret had been the only one who'd seen his humanity, who'd never once treated him like a walking bank account, but simply as a person who deserved respect. The masks had fallen, and Jonathan had to face what he'd discovered. That worth wasn't worn. It wasn't displayed in designer clothes or luxury cars or social media posts. It was lived in quiet acts of service and compassion that nobody saw and nobody applauded. Margaret, I need to be honest with you about something, Jonathan said, sitting down in the chair beside her instead of standing above her, meeting her at eye level because that's what she deserved. I conducted this experiment out of cynicism and loneliness, expecting everyone to fail, expecting you all to prove my father's warning correct, that when you're this rich, nobody loves you for who you are. But you didn't just pass some test I created. You revealed something I'd forgotten in my wealth-insulated world. He reached across the table and gently took her hand, and she didn't pull away. You showed me that true character isn't about what you say or what you promise. It's about what you do when nobody's watching, when there are no rewards and no recognition. You showed me that dignity isn't about what you possess, but about what you do with what you're given. And Margaret, you have more dignity in your little finger than most people I know have in their entire bodies. Margaret was crying again, but differently now, softer, and she squeezed his hand back. I know this is unconventional, and I know there's a huge power imbalance here that makes this complicated, Jonathan said carefully, choosing his words with more care than he'd ever chosen anything in his life. But would you have dinner with me sometime? Not as my employee, not as my maid, but as Margaret, as yourself, as the extraordinary woman you are. Margaret looked at him with those honest eyes, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything, just studied his face like she was trying to determine if this was real or some extension of the test. Mr. Sterling, I don't know if that's a good idea, she said quietly. We live in very different worlds, and I don't want to be some project for you, some way to feel better about yourself. You're right to be cautious, Jonathan said immediately. And you're right that our worlds are different, but Margaret, for the first time in years, I feel like someone actually sees me instead of just appraising my net worth. I'm not asking you to be a project, I'm asking you to help me understand how you see the world, because your way seems a lot healthier than mine. She smiled then, small and tentative but genuine, and she nodded once. Okay, Margaret said softly. One dinner, as equals, and we'll see where it goes from there. They talked for hours that night after the catering staff had quietly cleared away the untouched food, sitting in Jonathan's study with coffee and the kind of honest conversation he hadn't had in years. Margaret told him about Hope House and the teenagers she mentored, about her dream of opening a full-service community center that could provide job training and childcare and food assistance all under one roof, about her philosophy that money was just a tool, and it was what you built with it that actually mattered. Jonathan listened and asked questions and felt something shifting in his understanding of what wealth was actually for, what it could do when wielded with intention and compassion instead of hoarded or displayed. 6 weeks later, Jonathan stood in a converted warehouse in Queens surrounded by families from Margaret's neighborhood, watching as she cut the ribbon on the new community center that bore a plaque reading, "Built in partnership with the Sterling Foundation." Angela was a distant memory, a lesson learned about the difference between beauty and substance, and Gabriella had launched her startup with a professional reference from Jonathan that was honest about her skills, even if their relationship had ended awkwardly. But Margaret had become something Jonathan couldn't quite name yet, something that was slowly, carefully growing into love built on a foundation of genuine respect and shared values. They were taking things slowly, with Margaret insisting on maintaining her own apartment and her own independence, even as Jonathan invested in her dreams not as charity, but as genuine partnership. He'd learned that the experiment had tested him as much as it had tested them, that he'd been the one who needed to change, to open his eyes to the reality that worth had nothing to do with price tags and everything to do with character. As Jonathan watched Margaret embrace Mrs. Chen, fully recovered now and volunteering at the new center, he realized that the woman he'd overlooked, the one who'd moved through his home like a quiet shadow, had turned out to be the light he'd been searching for all along. His wealth finally felt purposeful instead of isolating, and for the first time since his father had warned him about the cost of being rich, Jonathan understood that maybe the real treasure wasn't finding someone who loved him despite his money, but finding someone who showed him how to use it to build something that actually mattered. Margaret caught his eye across the crowded room and smiled, and Jonathan smiled back, and in that moment, everything felt exactly right. Subscribe to Stand Against Manipulation.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out.